Sonic VHS tapes up to 4 hours of
TV Guide magazine.
See if you can jump a whole lot more. Skip it, skip it.
Do you ever feel old just because you grew up with things no one even remembers now? These everyday objects shaped how we played, learned, and connected, long before everything went digital. But if they meant so much then, why does it feel like we never talked about them again? There was something sacred about Saturday mornings, not just the smell of cereal or the soft hum of the television, but the sheer magic of knowing that for the next few hours, you ruled the living room. You didn't need streaming platforms or remotes with voice commands. Just a giant box television, a bowl of your favorite sugar-laced breakfast, and a lineup of characters that were somehow more exciting than the ones in your real life. Bugs Bunny, Scooby-Doo, He-Man, and Jem and the Holograms, they were more than just cartoons. They were the rhythm of your weekend, the heartbeat of childhood. Every episode was a reward for surviving 5 days of early alarms and homework. Back then, cartoons weren't available on demand. If you missed it, you missed it. And when that final show wrapped up and the cheesy public service announcements came on, you felt it. The cartoon spell was broken, and the reality of chores or church the next morning started creeping back in. You might be old if you remember when your entire week built up to Saturday morning. And maybe part of you still misses it. Because the idea of sitting cross-legged on shag carpet, bathed in the blue glow of a zenith screen, just hits different. No worries, no bills, just animated chaos and joy before the world woke up. That feeling doesn't really come back, but remembering it, that's still pretty sweet. Be kind, rewind. That wasn't just a phrase, it was a rule. A golden standard for any kid with a membership card from Blockbuster or the corner video store. If you grew up during the VHS era, rewinding tapes was as natural as brushing your teeth. And let's be honest, that little whirring sound from the VCR, kind of satisfying. Renting a movie was a full experience. You walked in, picked up the big plastic box with the beat-up cover art, and hoped the last person had the decency to rewind it. Spoiler alert, they usually didn't, which meant you had to sit there watching the tape rewind like it was some ancient ritual. Unless you had a separate rewinder, which was basically a luxury appliance for the truly prepared, but this wasn't just about tapes, it was about time, patience, anticipation. You did not skip scenes or jump chapters, you watched it through. And rewinding wasn't a chore. It was part of the rhythm of movie nights. That quiet moment when the film was over and the credits rolled, and you just sat there, full of popcorn and feelings, giving the tape its reset. You might be old if you remember holding the rewind button like it was a gift, because you knew once the screen went dark and the numbers on the display spun backward, you were ready to live it all again, even if it was for the 100th time. Before insulated lunch bags and microwavable containers, there were metal lunchboxes. Solid, clunky, and loud, especially when they slammed shut or hit the floor. But these weren't just for holding your peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple. These were your badge of honor. Your cultural identity displayed right on the cafeteria table. Whether it was the A-Team, Care Bears, Knight Rider, or My Little Pony, your lunchbox said everything about you. And let's not forget the matching thermos inside, with a plastic lid you used as a cup, usually filled with something warm like tomato soup or watered-down apple juice. That thermos always leaked a little, always. But you didn't care. You were the kid with Voltron on your lunchbox, or Alf or the Smurfs. That mattered. These boxes were traded, treasured, and sometimes dented beyond recognition after a rough game of Foursquare. And even when you outgrew them, they usually found a second life as a container for crayons, stickers, or secret notes you didn't want anyone to find. You might be old if you remember checking your lunchbox before school like it was a suitcase for a cross-country trip, because it wasn't just lunch. It was a portable piece of your personality. And when someone else in class had the same one, that was either instant friendship or a full-on rivalry. There was a certain art to adjusting rabbit ears. You didn't just move them, you coaxed them, tilted them just so. maybe wrapped some tin foil around the ends like you were building a home science experiment. Television in the pre-cable days was not just passive entertainment, it was active problem solving. Your favorite show came on at 7 p.m., and if the signal was bad, you had to get up. From the couch, no remote, and fiddle with those wiry antennas on top of the box. Sometimes you had to hold them yourself and freeze in place like a human signal booster while your sibling yelled, "That's it! Don't move!" Static lines would dance across the screen, ghost images would double up, and somehow that was still good enough. You might be old if you remember standing beside the TV like a statue, arm outstretched, trying to bring Wheel of Fortune or The Wonder Years into full focus. Because when those rabbit ears worked, even for a second, it felt like a tiny miracle. We weren't spoiled by high definition. We were grateful for visibility. And that little zap of satisfaction when the picture finally cleared up, that felt like winning a battle. You earned that show. You worked for it. And that made watching it feel 10 times better. There was a time when every kitchen drawer had a phone book. Big, thick, yellow or white, with more pages than a small-town library. You didn't scroll. You flipped. And every household had their own method of bookmarking the important numbers. Dog-eared pages, post-it notes, or a rogue pen mark that barely made sense. You want pizza? Find it under P. Want to call your best friend? Hope you remembered their last name and how to spell it. Because this was the age when your brain was the original contacts list. Memorizing numbers was a rite of passage. You had your home number, your cousin's number, and maybe your crush's number etched into your memory like holy scripture. And payphones? You either knew the number or you didn't call. There was no backup, no autofill. You might be old if you remember spinning the rotary or jabbing buttons on a push-tone phone and hearing each digit like it had weight. Because calling someone was deliberate, intentional. And when the line finally connected and someone answered, it felt personal. Even if it was just to say, "Is Joey home?" That's how connection worked. Manual, messy, real. If you grew up with cassette tapes, then you know the heartbreak of a tangled ribbon. 1 second you're listening to your favorite mix, and the next, silence. Tape eaten, chewed up inside the player like a bad secret. But that's where the number 2 pencil came in. That little yellow lifesaver was more than a writing tool. You slid it into the cassette reel and spun it slowly, rewinding the tape like you were performing surgery. And when you saved it, felt like a win. Creating a mixtape was an act of love. You had to sit by the radio, finger hovering over record, waiting for that song to come on. Sometimes the DJ would talk over the intro and ruin it, but you kept going because you had a theme, a vibe, and someone you were probably thinking of. You might be old if you remember the satisfaction of labeling a cassette with a black marker and knowing exactly what track came next. No shuffle, no skip, just careful curation, from Journey to Janet Jackson. That's how we shared our feelings, through hissy tape mixes, cracked cases, and homemade cover art. Before microwavable trays and air fryers, there were TV dinners, neatly portioned, wrapped in foil, and always a little too hot in some places and still frozen in others. But we didn't care, because these were the meals of kings, or at least the kind of kings who got to eat in front of the television. You peeled back the foil, poked the brownie with a fork to cool it down, and carefully avoided burning your tongue on the Salisbury steak. Everything had its place. Mashed potatoes in one corner, peas and carrots in another. And heaven forbid they touched. TV dinners made you feel like the future had arrived. No dishes, no waiting. Just 25 minutes in the oven and your evening was set. You might be old if you remember balancing a metal tray on your knees while watching Murder, She Wrote. And yeah, the peas were always weirdly hard. But somehow, that was part of the charm. It wasn't gourmet, but it was yours. And there was something about having your own little meal. No sharing, no passing bowls. Just you, your dinner, and the glow of the television. The rule was simple. Be home when the streetlights come on. That was the clock we lived by. There were no cell phones or text messages to check in. Your parents just hoped you were somewhere safe, probably 2 blocks over, trading baseball cards or riding your bike like it was a motorcycle. The whole neighborhood was your playground. Driveways, backyards, alleyways, front porches. You had a crew. Sometimes 5 kids, sometimes 20, and you made your own fun. Sidewalk chalk, hopscotch, capture the flag, or a messy game of tag that somehow covered 3 yards and a bush. The world felt big, but it also felt safe. And when someone's mom yelled your name from a front door, you knew it was time. You might be old if you remember that long walk home with a flashlight made of fireflies in a jar, your sneakers muddy and your heart full. Childhood wasn't curated back then. It was built, scratched together from whatever you had, and it was glorious. Before streaming menus and watch lists, there was the TV guide. A small insert in the Sunday paper that told you everything you needed to know for the week ahead. Page after page of tiny grids, show titles, air times, and network abbreviations. You'd sit at the kitchen table with a pen, circling what you wanted to catch, and praying no one else in the house would change the channel when it came on. This was planning, strategy, commitment. You couldn't just watch something later. If you missed it, you were out of luck. And if 2 shows aired at the same time, you had to make choices, real ones. You might be old if you remember flipping through that booklet and arguing over what to watch at 8 p.m. on Thursday. Because back then, you couldn't binge an entire series. You waited, you watched, you hoped. That little guide, printed on paper that smelled like Sunday mornings and coffee, was your compass. And it felt good to mark up those pages like you were crafting your own entertainment itinerary. A handful of change felt like a fortune. You walked in with a nickel, maybe a dime, and walked out with a paper bag full of dreams. Jawbreakers, fireballs, wax bottles, root beer barrels, and taffy that stuck to your molars like glue. Penny candy stores were magic. Usually tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, they smelled like sugar and dust and childhood. The store owner always knew your name, or at least your face. You pointed to jars behind the counter, and they'd scoop the candy out like you were royalty. And the best part? The freedom to choose. Every piece felt like a decision, a reward. You might be old if you remember how heavy a paper bag could feel with just 10 cents of candy inside, because it wasn't about price. It was about joy, a tangible kind. And nothing, not gourmet chocolate or fancy boutique sweets, has ever quite measured up. Remember the thrill of coming home and seeing that little red light blinking? That meant you had a message. Not a text, not a notification, a real voice. Answering machines with mini cassette tapes were your connection to the outside world when you were gone. You'd hear your own voice, a little awkward, probably rushed, saying something like, "Hi, we're not home, leave a message." Then a beep, and the mystery would unfold. Maybe it was your friend calling about a sleepover. Maybe it was your crush, or maybe it was just your aunt asking about casserole. Either way, it mattered. And if the tape ran out or you rewound it too far, you'd lose part of the message forever. You might be old if you remember sticking a pencil into one of those tiny reels, trying to save a tape from getting eaten by the machine. And let's not forget the panic when you accidentally erased something important. There was no cloud, no backup, just a hissy tape with real voices and memories recorded in plastic. That blinking light was hope. That little cassette, a time capsule. You did not just push a button to get a breeze. You reached down, grabbed the handle, and cranked the window open with some good old-fashioned elbow grease. Manual window cranks were the standard, and if you were sitting in the back seat during a long drive, that was your workout. Sometimes they stuck. Sometimes they squeaked, but no one complained. That little circular handle meant you had some control, even if the car barely had air conditioning. There was something satisfying about the way it clicked as you turned, like you were physically unlocking the wind. You felt accomplished every time that glass panel made it all the way down. If you wanted more air, you worked for it. And during summer road trips, those windows rolled down halfway to freedom, hot wind blasting in and making your hair go wild. You might be old if you remember fighting with a sibling over who got to roll their window down first. There was a kind of pride in knowing how far to crank before it jammed, how to angle it so rain wouldn't get in. It was clunky, it was imprecise, but it was yours. And let's be honest, half the fun was pretending the handle was a gear shift when the car was parked. Beep, that sound was the signal, not a phone notification or a bell. It meant the teacher, or some unlucky student, had to click the projector forward to the next slide. School film strips were slow, dusty, and often a little out of sync, but they were the height of visual learning in classrooms across America. You'd sit in your tiny desk, squinting at a white screen as scratchy narration tried to explain the Revolutionary War or how a volcano erupts. Half the slides were blurry, the audio was always tinny, sometimes the machine would jam, and everyone would groan like it was the end of the world. But when it worked, it felt like the class had been transported, even if only for 12 minutes. And if the teacher missed a beep, chaos. Students would whisper, they skipped one, like it was a national crisis. But you learned to follow along. And when the strip ended and the lights came back on, it felt like waking up from a weird educational dream. You might be old if you remember that jolt of disappointment when you realized it was back to reading from the textbook. Those beeps meant a break from the usual. A small thrill. A classroom field trip without ever leaving your seat. Jello salads were the showstoppers at every family potluck. Bright, jiggly, and filled with surprises. Sometimes good, sometimes questionable. Lime green with canned pineapple, orange with shredded carrots, and yes, occasionally a stray shrimp or olive. Nobody quite knew where the recipe came from, but somehow it ended up on every holiday table. It was the weird cousin of dessert and side dish, trying to do both and nailing neither. They were flashy in a way no meatloaf could ever dream of. Glossy, molded, practically trembling with drama. And every time one was brought in, someone would say, "Oh, that again," then take a scoop anyway. But still, you took a scoop. Because Grandma made it. Because it was tradition. And because it was always served in one of those glass bowls that had lived in the family longer than you had. You might be old if you remember that cold, wobbling tower sitting next to the stuffing and turkey. And even if you never liked it, you kind of miss seeing it there. It was a conversation piece, a culinary dare, a gelatinous mystery wrapped in nostalgia. They were loud, they were dangerous, and they were the coolest toy on the blocks until someone got a welt the size of a golf ball. Clackers were two hard acrylic balls attached to a string. You held the center and swung them up and down until they smacked together rhythmically above and below your hand. The goal? Keep them going. The result? Usually a bruised wrist or a cracked window. They made noise, they left bruises, and they were banned in more schools than you can count. But in those few glorious years, they were pure playground chaos in the best way. But man, when you got it right, it felt like you unlocked a secret skill. They came in every color. Some even sparkled. You'd show them off at recess like they were ninja weapons. And they kind of were. You might be old if you remember the satisfying click-clack echoing across a playground, followed by a teacher yelling, "Put those away before someone gets hurt," which happened. A lot. But it never stopped anyone. Because mastering clackers made you feel like a legend, even if it meant a trip to the nurse's office. Before Google, before digital catalogs, there was the card catalog, a giant wooden chest full of drawers, and inside, a universe of index cards, each one meticulously typed with book titles, author names, and those mysterious Dewey Decimal numbers. You had to know what you were looking for. You had to sort by subject. And then you had to write it down and go hunt through the actual shelves. Some kids got good at it, real good, flipping through drawers like card sharks at a Vegas table. Others just liked the rhythm of it, the soft swish of cards sliding under your fingers. It was research with muscle, and if someone had the book checked out, you waited. There was no ebook, no PDF, just hope. You might be old if you remember the smell of those cards, that dry, papery scent of knowledge in waiting. Flipping through them felt like diving into something important. And that thunk when you shut the drawer? Satisfying in a way nothing digital has ever been. The library was quiet. But the card catalog? That was the heartbeat. You could smell them before they reached your desk. That inky, slightly sweet, almost addictive scent of freshly printed mimeograph sheets. The paper was cool to the touch and often slightly damp. The ink? Purple. Always purple. Teachers would pass them out like sacred scrolls, and half the class would lift them to their faces just to take a whiff. These were your handouts, quizzes, reading assignments, anything copied en masse before the copier machine ruled the world. They never lined up perfectly, and sometimes the edges were blurry, but no one cared. What mattered was that you had something fresh off the press, warm with purpose. The text sometimes smudged, images looked like blurry cave drawings. But it worked. It got the job done. You might be old if you remember stacking those papers neatly in a folder with frayed edges and doodles in the margins, because even though the pages were rough, they were yours. And if you got to run them off in the teacher's lounge, you were basically royalty. Outdoor toys were not about screens. They were about balance, bruises, and sometimes borderline injury. The pogo ball was one part balance trainer, one part glorified balloon, a rubber ball stuck inside a plastic disc. You stepped on it and bounced, hoping to stay upright more than 5 seconds. Skip-its were ankle breakers in disguise. You'd strap it on, swing the plastic loop around, and jump as the counter clicked with each successful hop. If you hit 20 spins, you were a legend. If you hit 30, you were playground royalty with sore calves. Miss one and faceplant? Oh well. Try again. These were the toys of sidewalk Olympics, of backyard competitions, and recess legends. You might be old if your ankles still ache when someone says, "Skip it." But you also smile, because you remember the rush, the sweat, and the sense of victory when you hit double digits on the counter. There was a time when every car had an ashtray, not just in the front, but in the back seat too, sometimes even with built-in lighters. It was normal, expected. Smoke hung in the air, windows cracked just a little. Even if no one used it, the ashtray was there. It was a tiny drawer that slid out beneath the radio or nestled in the door. And the lighter? You pressed it in, waited for the pop, and pulled it out with a glowing orange coil. It was mesmerizing. It felt like grown-up magic. Fire at the push of a button, hiding in the dash like a secret trick. You never used it, but it always fascinated you. As kids, we were warned not to touch it, but we always wanted to. You might be old if you remember road trips with the faint smell of burnt tobacco and leather seats. That smell burned into memory. The ashtray wasn't just for cigarettes. It held coins, gum wrappers, and sometimes your dad's loose change. It was just part of the dashboard, a quiet relic of a different era. There was a time when television said goodnight, not with an episode, not with a preview, but with the national anthem. The screen would fade to an American flag waving in the wind, with patriotic music playing in the background. Then, static, or color bars. That was the end of the broadcast day. No late-night infomercials, no endless reruns. Just silence. If you were still up when the screen went dark, it meant you stayed up too late. And something about it felt final, like the world had gone to sleep and left you behind. You might be old if you remember watching that flag, not because you were patriotic, but because there was literally nothing else on. That sign-off was a signal, time to turn it off, time to rest, time to remember that even television had boundaries. And honestly, that was kind of comforting. Before PowerPoint presentations and animated Bible apps, there were felt boards, or as many of us knew them, those fuzzy backdrops where Jesus stuck on with Velcro magic. They were dusty, worn out, and usually leaning against a chalkboard or easel in a tiny Sunday school classroom. The teacher would pull out a bag full of felt people, long-haired disciples, sheep, shepherds, a surprisingly tan Moses, and start building the story piece by piece. Noah's Ark? Slap on some cartoon animals. The Nativity? Mary and Joseph never stood straight, but they stuck around just long enough to deliver the message. There was something weirdly mesmerizing about it all. Watching the felt characters float across that fabric landscape was like watching your imagination stitched into real time. Sometimes the figures would fall mid-lesson, landing in a heap of parables and sandals. But that never stopped the story. You might be old if you remember quietly reaching out to press one of those characters back onto the board when the teacher wasn't looking. And if you ever got picked to move the felt pieces yourself, that was a big deal. You were the chosen one. It felt sacred, holy even. Felt boards were slow, quiet, a little awkward, but they worked. And they had this soft, unpolished charm that no animation could ever replace. They didn't just teach you stories, they helped you feel them. You saw the pieces come together right in front of you, not on a screen, but with hands and patience and static cling. It made faith feel touchable, real. You probably never realized it at the time, but those fuzzy scenes stuck with you long after Sunday morning ended. There was a time when the smell of autumn wasn't pumpkin spice. It was smoke, sharp, earthy, comforting in a way that wrapped around you like a warm blanket. Burning leaves was as much a fall tradition as carving pumpkins or raking up a massive pile just to jump in. After a long afternoon of clearing the yard, families would gather the dried-up leaves, maple, oak, sycamore, and light them up in a slow, crackling burn at the curb or in the backyard. It was controlled, ritualistic, and completely normal. You stood there watching the flames dance through crispy piles, the smoke curling up into the gray sky while your jacket soaked in the scent that stayed until spring. It wasn't just about getting rid of leaves. It was about a season ending, a quiet signal that winter was coming. And for some reason, it made everything feel still, almost sacred. You might be old if the smell of burning leaves still yanks you back to childhood, to that golden hour glow, to watching your dad poke at the pile with a stick like he was tending to a sacred fire. There were no leaf blowers humming in the background, just the soft snap of twigs and the rustle of dry things turning to ash. Eventually, cities banned it. Air quality laws and neighborhood complaints replaced the practice. Now, leaves are bagged up, trucked away, efficient, clean, but something got lost. That little ritual of transition, that moment of warmth in the cooling air. And even now, when the wind picks up and carries the faintest scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, a part of you aches for that pile, that flame, that perfect autumn hush. If you grew up with a porch, you probably grew up with milk bottles too. Not the plastic jugs we see today, but thick, cold glass containers, lined up neatly in a metal carrier by the door. The milkman came early, real early, and by the time you stumbled into the kitchen rubbing sleep from your eyes, there it was. Condensation dripping down the glass, a little paper cap on top. Sometimes with cream settled so thick you had to shake it like a maraca. It felt like magic. You did not go to the store. You did not even have to ask. It just appeared. There was a rhythm to it. Empty bottles out, full bottles in, like trading stories with someone you never saw. You might be old if you remember the clink of those bottles as your mom carried them inside, or the panic when someone knocked one over and it shattered into 1,000 cold, sticky pieces on the kitchen floor. Milk delivery wasn't just about milk. It was about a connection. The idea that your home was part of a neighborhood web, a route, a routine, a promise. And if you were lucky, maybe you got chocolate milk too, or eggs, or butter. Little luxuries brought to your doorstep without ever logging in or checking out. Eventually, the milkman stopped coming. Supermarkets took over, delivery turned digital, and the old glass bottles, they became vases or antiques. But for those who remember, they still hold weight. Real weight. The kind you can feel when you pick one up, smell the cold cream, and remember a time when milk came to you, not the other way around. You could not walk into a house in the 1970s without seeing one. Macrame plant hangers hanging from curtain rods, ceiling hooks, or maybe even a rusty nail in the corner of the kitchen. Woven rope, knotted in intricate patterns, holding terracotta pots that spilled over with spider plants, ferns, or ivy. They were decorative, sure, but they were also a statement. Earthy, bohemian, a little rebellious in a post-suburban shag carpet kind of way. These hangers were everywhere, and they were usually homemade. Someone's aunt, someone's neighbor, maybe your mom, pulling cords tight on the living room floor while watching a talk show. There was something meditative about it. The repetition, the soft creak of the rope, the satisfaction of a plant suspended just right. You might be old if you remember brushing past one too fast and getting smacked in the face by a trailing vine. Or if you remember the way the knotted rope smelled like dust and summer and maybe a little mildew. They were not sleek, they were not modern, but they were full of personality. Eventually, they faded from fashion, replaced by cleaner lines, minimalist shelves. But they never quite disappeared. And lately, they're back, hanging in trendy apartments and cafes, selling for 3 times what your mom paid for a spool of cord. But the originals, the slightly uneven ones, the ones with beads and sun-faded spots, those meant something. They were crafted with care. Part art, part plant holder, part quiet rebellion. And they made any house feel like home. It was not just the rink, it was the whole vibe. Roller rinks were full-blown sensory experiences. The smell of sweaty rental skates, the sticky sweet aroma of cherry slushies, and the blast of disco tracks that made your heart race. And oh yeah, carpeted walls. Bright, patterned, borderline psychedelic walls that made you feel like you were skating through a neon dream. These places were electric. Lights spun overhead. Couples held hands. Solo skaters showed off like they were in a music video. You skated fast until your legs burned, then coasted to the edge, where that infamous carpet absorbed your fall like a giant, ugly sponge. You might be old if your knees still remember hitting that wall, or if you remember leaning against it, out of breath, sipping from a waxy paper cup and catching your breath before the reverse skate started. The DJ booth sat up high like a throne, playing Funky Town, YMCA, or Billie Jean, and calling out birthday shout-outs and the occasional slow skate only. There were arcade machines lining the edges, a snack bar selling pizza that somehow always tasted exactly the same, and a feeling in the air that you just belonged there. Eventually, roller rinks started closing down, one by one. Too expensive to maintain, too retro to stay cool. But for those of us who grew up on 4 wheels and carpeted crashes, the memories never left. That sound of skate wheels over wood, of laughter echoing through pulsing lights, is still skating circles in our heads. There was no intention to buy anything, and everyone knew it. The furniture store with the free popcorn machine was Dad's idea of a Saturday outing. You would walk in and get hit with that smell, leather, fresh carpet, and hot butter. Dad would head straight for the recliners, and you? Straight to the red and silver popcorn machine near the back. It was always humming, full of those little white bags that were supposed to be single-serve, but somehow you found a way to go back 5 times without getting caught. Meanwhile, Dad was doing his test sit. That meant stretching, sighing, and rocking the recliner back and forth like he was making a real decision. "Too stiff," he would say. "This one's a back killer." The sales guy always came over and Dad would nod along, arms crossed, like he was closing in on the deal of the century. But you knew he was not buying a couch, he just liked the idea of picking one. And that popcorn? It was better than movie theater popcorn because it was earned. All this to say, shopping never felt like shopping with Dad. It felt like a game. But speaking of buttons, lights, and games, let me tell you about the kind of place where Dad's inner nerd really came to life. Waterbeds promised the future and delivered waves of regret. On paper, they were perfect, a heated mattress that cradled your body like a floating dream. But in practice, not so much. Every turn sent ripples across the surface. You tried to roll over, and the whole bed sloshed like a bathtub during an earthquake. Getting in without making a tidal wave was a skill. Getting out without sliding to the floor was an Olympic event. They were heavy, hard to move, and leaked at the worst times, usually at 3 in the morning, soaking everything from socks to shag carpet. Still, they were trendy. If someone had a waterbed, it meant they were either incredibly cool or easily convinced by an in-store demo. Some people swore by them. Others swore at them. Pets hated them. Kids loved jumping on them until they learned that waterbeds and sharp objects do not mix. But for a brief, glorious window in the 1980s, having a waterbed meant you had arrived. It was furniture and flex all in one. Looking back, they were impractical, ridiculous, and unforgettable. And somewhere, in a dusty corner of a basement, one is still gently sloshing, waiting for its comeback. The shopping mall was more than a place to buy things. It was the beating heart of teenage life. You did not just go to the mall, you lived there. It was where you met your friends, saw your crush, and discovered who you wanted to be. The food court was your kingdom. The arcade was your battleground. And the record store? That was your soul. Malls in the 80s were social cathedrals built from neon lights and polished tiles. You tried on clothes you could not afford. You loitered for hours. You flirted by the Orange Julius. And if you were lucky, your favorite store had a photo booth to capture the chaos. Escalators became runways. Hallways were arenas of style and identity. Whether it was Spencer's, The Gap, or Foot Locker, every store felt like its own little world. You were not just shopping, you were performing. The mall was your stage. Your friends were your co-stars. And the soundtrack? A steady stream of synth pop and laughter echoing off the glass. It was where friendships began and hearts broke, where trends were born and gossip spread faster than wildfire. In the 80s, the mall was not just a building, it was the center of the universe. There were no signs, no trails, and definitely no cell reception. Not that it mattered. The hidden fishing hole Dad always took you to might as well have been a secret passed down through generations. You had to park on a dirt shoulder, hop a barbed wire fence, and walk through brush that snagged at your socks like it wanted you to turn back. But then, there it was. A quiet patch of water framed by trees and pure silence. No people, just frogs, the buzz of dragonflies, and the occasional splash of something just out of sight. Dad would hand you a rod, already rigged, and say, "Let's see if they're biting today," like it was a ritual. He always had a story about the one that got away, usually involving a fish the size of your leg and a broken line. You never saw it, but you believed him. And on the days you did catch something, even if it was just a bluegill the size of a cookie, he would hoot and holler like you had just pulled up Moby Dick. You would sit there side by side, quiet except for the occasional snack or Dad humming an old tune. But if you want to hear about the reward after a good fishing trip, let me take you to the drive-through dairy farm. Glass bottles, cold milk, and maybe even ice cream. Before Nintendo, video games were gasping for breath. After Nintendo, they were alive again. It was 1985 when the Nintendo Entertainment System hit American shelves and changed living rooms forever. The gray and red console was a Trojan horse, simple in design but hiding worlds inside. Suddenly, you were not just a kid. You were Mario, leaping through pipes to save the princess. You were Link, braving dungeons for the Triforce. You were part of something massive. Nintendo did not just bring games. It brought heroes. It brought soundtracks you could hum in your sleep and cheat codes whispered like secret spells. The controller became an extension of your hand. Blowing into cartridges felt like a ritual, and beating a level felt like beating life itself. For many, Nintendo was not a toy. It was a friend, a daily escape, a safe place to fail and try again. Families gathered around the screen, arguing over whose turn it was. Siblings became rivals, parents got curious, and the living room was never the same again. With every beep and pixel, Nintendo gave us wonder, and it never asked for anything more than time and imagination. The Firehouse Pancake Breakfast was not just a fundraiser. It was a local holiday. Dad would wake you up early on a Sunday, say, "Put on your shoes." And before you could ask questions, you were in line behind a dozen people all craving the same thing, a plate piled high with pancakes. The folding chairs wobbled, the long tables had little dents and permanent syrup rings, and everything smelled like melted butter and maple sugar. Real maple syrup was a luxury, so they used the bottled kind, the kind that came out slow and stuck the lid shut like glue. Firefighters in aprons manned the griddles, flipping pancakes like they had trained for it. Dad would nod in approval, pile his plate, and crack a joke to someone in line about how This was the real breakfast of champions. Dad never won, but he always bought 5 tickets just in case. It was not about the pancakes, really. It was about community, about showing up. And when breakfast was over, he would say, "Let's make a stop on the way back." That stop? Usually a roadside museum with one very questionable claim to fame. Trapper Keepers were not just school supplies, they were status symbols. With their Velcro flaps and glossy over-the-top covers, they turned every classroom into a silent competition of who had the coolest binder. Some featured racing cars. Others showed rainbows, unicorns, or abstract laser patterns straight out of a sci-fi fever dream. Inside, everything was neatly organized. Folders, dividers, loose leaf paper, and secret notes passed during math class. The Velcro made a loud rip every time you opened it, an announcement that learning was about to begin, or at least be attempted. Trapper Keepers made you feel like you had your life together, even if your grades said otherwise. Teachers had a love-hate relationship with them. They were bulky, distracting, but undeniably effective at keeping your stuff in one place. And if you had one with a matching pencil case, you were royalty. Years later, people still remember the smell of the plastic, the feel of flipping through those laminated folders, and the thrill of sliding in a new pack of notebook paper. Trapper Keepers were not just for school, they were for showing off, staying organized, and feeling like you had a little piece of the future in your backpack. It started with 6 colors, just 6. But somehow, it unlocked a puzzle that would challenge millions of minds and define an era. The Rubiks Cube was not just a toy. It was an obsession, a flex, a frustration, and a badge of honor, all crammed into a twisting, clicking square. You either solved it or you peeled the stickers off. There was no in-between. Classrooms, kitchens, and family living rooms were all temporary battlegrounds for who could line up the colors first. It looked simple, but it demanded patience, logic, and a kind of determination that made it feel like a test of character. And oh, the speed solvers, like magicians, like gods. The cube became a status symbol among kids and a stress toy for adults. It was everywhere: commercials, competitions, cereal box giveaways. You were not cool if you had not at least tried to conquer it. For a moment, the Rubiks Cube was the brainy heart of the decade, a symbol of what it meant to be smart and stylish. It taught an entire generation to keep twisting, keep trying, and keep believing that order could come from chaos. The GoKart Track with 0 safety rules looked like it was built by someone who once saw a racetrack in a dream and then tried to recreate it with duct tape and a prayer. The sign out front read, "Family Fun." But you knew this was Dad's kind of fun. He paid cash to a man with a sunburn and a clipboard, and before you knew it, you were strapping into a plastic rocket with wheels. No seatbelt, no helmet, just a stern warning. Do not hit your sister. Dad, of course, was already in his own cart, revving the engine like it was the Daytona 500. The track was a cracked loop with grass growing through it and tires stacked too high as a boundary. The exhaust fumes were strong enough to water your eyes, and the cart screeched like a choir of angry lawnmowers. You skidded, bumped, and spun out more than once, but you never forgot the thrill, especially when Dad passed you on the last lap, one hand on the wheel, the other waving smugly. That victory lap? It lasted all week, and if you were lucky, he would let you stay just a little longer, because the community swap meet down at the church lot was about to open, and Dad never missed that one. Mixtapes were handwritten love letters wrapped in cassette cases. You waited by the radio for hours just to hit record at the perfect moment, trying to catch the start of your favorite song without the DJ talking over it. You rewound, replayed, and carefully curated the perfect order so each track melted into the next. Some were made for crushes, others for best friends. Some were sorry tapes, and some were just because. Each one had a theme, a purpose, and a heart behind it. You picked songs that said what you could not. Then you labeled the tape in your best handwriting, maybe decorated the case, and handed it over like it was treasure. Because it was. A great mixtape took hours, sometimes days, to get just right. And when someone gave you one, You listened to it until the tape wore thin and the sound warped. Mixtapes were not just music. They were memories, feelings, time capsules wrapped in magnetic ribbon. And long after the songs faded, you remembered the person who made it, their handwriting, their choices, their message. Even now, in a world of playlists, nothing hits quite like the soft click of a tape deck and a song you once recorded just for someone else. There was a time when music lived only in sound. Then came 1981, and with it, a glowing screen that changed everything. Music television, better known as MTV. Suddenly, music had a face, a costume, a storyline, and a look that mattered just as much as the lyrics. It was not just about hearing your favorite artist, it was about watching them come alive in color. Madonna spun in lace gloves, Prince shimmered in purple silk, and Michael Jackson moonwalked straight into American living rooms like a ghost dancing across the carpet. For a generation growing up in the 80s, MTV was not just television. It was a mood. It was an identity. It was your coolest friend who introduced you to new bands at midnight. And the power it had? Unmatched. If MTV played your song, you were somebody. If they did not, you might as well be invisible. The channel became the tastemaker, gatekeeper, and trendsetter. Teens obsessed over VJs like they were movie stars. Style, language, and attitude spilled from the screen into everyday life. MTV turned bedrooms into dance floors and band posters into sacred wall shrines. This was the birth of visual culture as we know it, and it all started with a rocket ship and a music video. The community swap meet in the church parking lot was a patchwork quilt of folding tables, lawn chairs, and a whole lot of neighborhood hustle. It was always held early, way too early, and Dad would pull up with a thermos of coffee and a plan. This was not a place for big spenders. This was a battlefield of bartering. He would go straight to the tables stacked with transistor radios, old tools, and that mysterious plastic bin full of tangled cords that might be useful someday. You were eyeing the table with the mismatched action figures and board games missing all the pieces. There was always one guy who sold nothing but velvet Elvis paintings. No one ever saw him set up or pack up. He was just there. The swap meet had its regulars. The Tupperware lady with 1,000 lids and no matching containers. The comic guy who only sold back issues from 1974. And the woman with jars of jelly that looked more suspicious than sweet. But Dad? He moved through it all like a seasoned pro, chatting with everyone like they were old buddies, walking away with something bizarre like a mini fan or a set of ceramic pigs, and when he said, "Let's stop by the junkyard real quick," you knew things were about to get even stranger. Stirrup Pants were the 1980s attempt to combine fashion with function, and they did neither particularly well. These leggings had a strap that looped under your foot, supposedly to keep them from riding up. In reality, they pulled awkwardly at your ankles, made your feet sweat, and caused socks to bunch in weird places. But we wore them anyway. They came in bright colors, bold patterns, and every synthetic material known to mankind. They were stretchy, shiny, and often paired with oversized sweaters or blazers that made no logical sense. From the knees up, you looked like a school principal. From the knees down, you looked like a gymnast caught mid-warm-up. But Stirrup Pants had their moment. They were the go-to outfit for school picture day, mall trips, or just feeling like you belonged in a fashion catalog. The loop under the foot made you feel oddly secure, like your pants were holding onto you. Sure, they sagged in weird places. Sure, they made your calves look like sausages. But they were a staple, loved, mocked, and deeply missed. For anyone who wore them, Stirrup Pants were more than a fashion choice. They were a commitment, a stretch of spandex, and a rite of passage. If the 80s had a personality, it was neon, loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. Color was not just a trend, it was a statement, and no one whispered. Leg warmers in hot pink, tracksuits in electric blue, eyeshadow that could stop traffic. The entire decade looked like it had been dipped in a highlighter and blasted with a disco ball. It was not about subtlety, it was about standing out. Walk into any mall, any gym, any music video, and it was a rainbow riot. But this was not chaos, it was confidence. Kids wore neon shoelaces. Adults rocked neon windbreakers. Even toys and commercials buzzed with that wild fluorescent glow. It was the decade where fashion turned into rebellion through brightness, because after the muted earth tones of the 70s, the 80s decided to scream. And we listened. We wore color like armor. We matched green earrings to orange belts without blinking. Fashion became a kind of freedom, to be seen, to be remembered, to be unapologetically alive. And yeah, sometimes it was ridiculous. But it was fun. It was electric. And most of all, it was a sign of the times, a wild, glowing, unforgettable beacon of 80s spirit. The strip mall pet store did not smell like adventure. It smelled like wood shavings and fish food. But when Dad said, "Let's stop in for a minute," you knew it meant 20. The walls were lined with glass tanks full of turtles, frogs, and fish that looked too bright to be real. You would press your nose against the glass and point. "That one. I want that one." Dad would shake his head and smile. "We're not getting a turtle." 5 minutes later, you were holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, trying not to spill it on the seat of the car. He was not a pushover. He just knew the power of a memory. And that pet store, as humble as it was, felt like a mini zoo to you. There was always one sleepy lizard under a heat lamp and a parrot that squawked like a broken doorbell. Sometimes you would hear, "Hey there," from across the room and realize the bird was mocking you. Dad would strike up a conversation with the guy behind the counter like they were old war buddies, swapping advice on filters and food pellets. You would head home with a tank, a packet of food, and a new responsibility you were not quite ready for. And when you were ready for something outdoorsy, Dad knew just the place, with canoes and no life jackets in sight. Acid wash jeans were loud before you even opened your mouth. With their blotchy patterns and faded splotches, they looked like someone had taken a bleach bottle to denim, and somehow that became cool. These jeans were rebellious, messy, and unmistakably 1980s. Everyone had a pair. Some wore them tight-rolled at the ankle, others let them drape over high-top sneakers. Acid wash showed up in jackets, skirts, and full matching sets that turned entire outfits into walking eye strain. You could not blend in wearing acid wash. You stood out, and that was the point. It was denim with attitude. Rough, bold, a little chaotic. Parents hated it. Teachers rolled their eyes. But teens embraced the weirdness. It felt edgy, like you were wearing the uniform of a generation that refused to dress quietly. Old photographs now show groups of kids lined up in front of lockers, each one looking like they had just emerged from a bleach accident and loving it. Acid wash was not timeless. It was not flattering, but it was unforgettable. And in a decade known for excess, it fit right in. Even now, pulling on an old pair brings back the noise, the neon, and the thrill of breaking the fashion rules. Saturday mornings were sacred. You rolled out of bed in your pajamas, poured a sugary mountain of cereal, and turned on the television like it was a portal to another world. And what greeted you? Magic. Pure animated magic. Shows like He-Man, Transformers, DuckTales, and the Smurfs made those few hours feel like a festival of joy. These were not just cartoons, they were lifelines. The stories were bold, the heroes fearless, and the villains just scary enough to make victory feel earned. You learned about justice from turtles in bandanas, loyalty from robotic cars, and friendship from ponies with glittering eyes. Commercial breaks were an art form. The toys matched the shows, and the shows matched your dreams. This was marketing fused with myth-making, and we loved every second. Your parents saw it as noise, but you knew better. It was a weekly escape from school, chores, and whatever sadness the week might have brought. Those mornings felt endless, like time itself was bending in your favor. The television glowed with color and hope. And as the final credits rolled and the sun climbed higher, you held on to those last cartoon moments like a secret handshake only kids understood. The county auction barn was chaotic, dusty, and loud, and Dad loved every minute of it. From the second you stepped inside, it was a sensory overload. Wooden pens clucked with chickens, bleated with goats, and somewhere a sheep was loudly objecting to something. The auctioneer stood on a platform, voice rising and falling like a song only locals understood. He had his bidding number tucked into his shirt pocket and a mental budget that always magically doubled if the right box came along. There were tables of mystery items, rusty tools, mismatched Tupperware, bundles of wire, and once a broken vending machine that Dad swore he could fix. $10? That's a steal, he would whisper, just before being outbid by the same guy who always bid too high. You did not win much. But when Dad did walk out with something, it was like he had climbed Everest. And even when he lost, he laughed all the way home. The auction was not about getting stuff, it was about the thrill. But when he wanted a guaranteed win, all he needed was a firehouse griddle, a bottle of syrup, and a pancake breakfast made by heroes. They were not just actors, they were a reflection in the mirror of every teenager who ever felt lost, loud, or completely misunderstood. The Brat Pack did not invent high school drama, but they made it feel real, electric, and terrifyingly close to home. When you watched Molly Ringwald cry in detention, it was not just acting. It was every hallway humiliation, every awkward crush, and every secret you thought nobody else could possibly understand. John Hughes gave them the scripts, but it was the actors, Emilio Estevez, Judd Nelson, Ali Sheedy, Anthony Michael Hall, who gave the 80s its voice. These films did not just entertain, they defined. The Breakfast Club was not a movie, it was a therapy session. 16 Candles felt like a personal diary read aloud. Pretty in Pink asked whether love could survive cliques in class. They gave heart to rebellion, soul to sarcasm, and face to the faceless. The Brat Pack were not perfect, but they were ours. Messy, funny, fragile, and unforgettable. Their films dared to be earnest in a time of cynicism and cool, and decades later, they still feel like a warm letter from your teenage self, sealed in a VHS case, waiting to be remembered. Boombox battles turned sidewalks into stages and backpacks into speaker cabinets. In the 1980s, carrying a massive boombox on your shoulder was more than a way to listen to music. It was a declaration. You had style, you had taste, and you had batteries heavy enough to power a small city block. These machines blasted everything from hip-hop to hair metal, and they did not ask for permission. You walked down the street with your soundtrack trailing behind you, volume all the way up, head nodding to the beat. Some kids parked them at basketball courts. Others lined them up outside corner stores. Whoever had the best bass usually won the crowd. Tapes were traded, dials were turned, and sometimes spontaneous dance-offs broke out right there on the pavement. Boomboxes were heavy, awkward, and impossible to ignore. But in a time before smartphones and Bluetooth, they were portable pride. They made noise. They made statements. And if you saw someone approach with a fresh cassette in hand and a boombox on their shoulder, you knew something good was about to happen. Boombox battles were not just about the music. They were about being seen, heard, and remembered. The future did not arrive with a bang. It arrived in a beige plastic box that hummed quietly on a desk in the corner of your house. The Commodore 64, the Apple Macintosh. These were not just machines, they were portals into something entirely new. You typed, and the screen listened. You clicked, and doors opened. At first, it was simple. Word processors, floppy disks, a little green cursor blinking like it had a secret. But quickly, it became more. Games, learning, possibility. For kids, it was a playground. For parents, a tool. For dreamers, a revolution. It changed homework. It changed jobs. It changed you. That blinking cursor? It whispered that anything was possible. Families gathered around, just trying to figure it out together. The sound of a printer was like the future on paper. And the internet? Still a myth. Still a whisper. But you felt it coming. With every boot-up chime, every pixelated game, every painstaking keystroke, you were stepping into a new world. Personal computers did not just change technology. They changed lives. And for the first time ever, the future was not in a sci-fi movie. It was sitting on your desk. Some nights, it was the backyard. Other times, it was the town planetarium where the air smelled like metal seats and carpet glue. But either way, Dad made sure you always looked up. He would point at a blinking light in the sky and say something like, "That one's Venus," even if it was just an airplane. You believed him, because he said it with the same certainty he used when fixing the lawnmower. Sometimes he would bring out a telescope that never quite focused right, but it did not matter. You could see the moon, or at least a very bright blur that had to be the moon, and that was enough. He told you about constellations, meteor showers, and a comet he swore he saw when he was 12. The Planetarium nights were just as magical. You would lean back in those creaky seats while the ceiling lit up with galaxies and a deep voice narrated the birth of stars. Dad would whisper facts like he had a PhD in astronomy, even if he probably read them from the brochure 5 minutes before. You did not go to learn. You went to dream. And the only thing better than dreaming about space? Digging through the universe of stuff at the local flea market the very next weekend. If this sparked a memory, share it below, like the video, and subscribe for more trips back in time.